In this section, I want to talk about a very specific problem concerning the creation of instances. It's going to seem a little bit esoteric, but bear with me for a moment. So in the previous part, I made this class holding and represented a data structure. And the way that you made objects is you used the name of the class as a function. It said holding AA, and then you gave it input parameters, and then you ended up creating an object from that. So you made an instance using the class name. One of the problems that comes up is that sometimes you want to make objects in a different way. Like there might be multiple ways of creating an instance that you want. And the problem that you have to face is, how do you do that in a class? It turns out that a class can only have one init function. So if you want to create things in a different way, how do you do it? And to demonstrate this, I wanted to do an example involving dates. Python already has a library for dates, so don't use this code in your project, but I'm going to use it to kind of demonstrate a concept here. So let's say you had a class date where you took in a year, month, and a day. You're storing some information here. Okay, so here's your date object. And you can import that. I mean, I can say import, date ob, and then you make a date like 2012, 12/21, and you get the different attributes. How would you handle creating a date in a different way? Here's where I'm kind of getting at. Let's say you had a string that had that date 2007/06/11 in it. How would I make a date from that? One of the ways that you could do it is I could take like the string and split it into parts or something. And then I would have to maybe make a date object where I convert the parts into ints or something like this. I'd have to do some kind of conversion to make that work. I'd also have to type it correctly, apparently. So you get the idea that I'm going to have to do some sort of special processing to make that happen. And I might even write a function in here. I don't know, maybe I make a function like, date from string, where you give me a string and then I do that calculation. Okay, and then we return a date, parts 0 int parts 1 int parts 2. Let's say you did this. You have some function that creates a date from a string. It turns out that there's all sorts of problems that kind of arise from that. Let's say I import my date ob, and I say date object date from string 2007/06/11. Okay, so let's say I do that. One of the things that's sort of problematic about this is that the function is in some sense detached from the class. It's related to the class, but it's sort of detached. It's off in its own little world. The code just doesn't feel like it hangs together very well. This is a known problem in kind of the Python world, that you might want to have different ways of creating objects. And you need to figure out some way to sort of do this in a sensible way. One of the ways that this is done in Python is to define something known as a class method. This is an alternate way of solving this problem. What somebody will do is they'll make a class, they'll put what's known as a class method on it that might look something like this. I'll explain the CLS in a second. But what I'm going to do is take this code that I had before, and I'm going to rewrite it like that. Now, what is going to happen with this version of code, let me just run it on the date object here, is that if I want to make a date from a string, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the class name as a starting point. I would say date from string, and then I would pass in the string, and I would get kind of a date object from that. What I have is I have like a method that's kind of hanging off of the date class. I mean, I can either make a date from like specific year, month, day, or I can say date from string, where I create a date in a different way here. So two different ways of making a date. One of the things that this solves is kind of puts that alternate construction technique on the class itself. So it's kind of bundled in a nicer way. The other thing that's kind of interesting about how this works is this class method. What's special about that is that if you say something like date from string, what happens is this class that's to the left of the dot is actually what gets passed in as this CLS argument. Turns out that CLS there is kind of like a stand-in for date, basically. So what's happening is date comes in. I'm doing some special processing. And then here, this is kind of the same as saying date, year, month, day. In some sense, what I'm doing is I'm avoiding the problem of hard coding the class name in there. Okay, so this is kind of a different formulation of that. You'll actually see this used for other constructors as well. Like I could have a class method on here that, maybe gives me today's date. What I would do here is maybe get like the local time on my machine. Let's import the time module. And then I might say something like, well, return, the year, month, day from that. I think it's month and then month, day. This would also end up being another constructor. So let's try that out. So now you can make a date from like specific days. You could make a date from a string like that, or you could make a date from like today's date. Let's make sure that actually works correctly. It's a little bit of an esoteric topic, but it is something that sometimes comes up. People ask, how do I make an object that has more than one like construction method? This is sort of probably the more common way of doing it, is you would define a class with class method. Just as a final note, you might look at that and say, well, that's just weird. Like, why would you do class method? Or what's special about those that make it work? One of the benefits of doing it this way actually is the fact that the name of the class is not hard-coded in there. And that turns out to be useful when you start getting into more advanced uses. Like somebody might actually make a class that inherits from date. Like you could say class myDate inherits from date. And then maybe they start putting new methods on here. I mean, this is not the most interesting use of inheritance perhaps, but it turns out if you do that, this inherited class will actually get all of those alternate constructors. Like I can say D is equal to myDate.today, and it will get the attributes, and it will get the proper methods attached to it. So again, a little bit special purpose, but I think it's useful to know about if you ever are faced with that problem of how to do alternate constructors. Look at class methods to do that.